looking to set up a constitutional crisis and to crash the power and authority of the Supreme Court such that Trump is really just a total dictator. That seems to me an intentional, malevolent act that they're engaged in right now.
Constitutional crisis. It's a term that we hear a lot in political media, thrown around as though, it's something that happens all the time. But the Trump administration is apparently flouting a Supreme Court direction to help facilitate the return of a man sent to an El Salvador prison, which the DOJ and everyone involved has admitted was wrongfully arrested and detained. So if the Trump White House is deciding to ignore the Supreme Court justice decision, is that actually the first time that we're truly at a constitutional crisis? Are the checks and balances no longer in effect? And is this the first real step that we have towards a dictatorship? I'm Mediaite founding editor Colby Hall, and I asked this question of a good legal friend of mine, Andy Friedman, the interview of which is about to start. Joining me now is Andy Friedman, who's my local legal expert. When Dan Abrams is too busy to take my calls, I turn to Andy. Andy, you and I were on a text exchange this morning about this sort of bizarre conflict between the Trump administration and the Supreme Court. The thought occurred to me and some of our friends that if the White House, the executive branch, decides to ignore a Supreme Court order to, quote, facilitate the return of this man that they mistakenly arrested and took to El Salvador, what is their course of action? Like, doesn't that flout sort of accepted checks and balances? And isn't that the very definition of a constitutional crisis?
Sure. I mean, you're on the cusp, if not already in the midst of a constitutional crisis. So the Supreme Court directed the lower court to clarify its order, which the lower court then did. And the Trump administration's response to that was, nope, we can't give you clarity. It's out of our hands. This guy's in a foreign country subject to foreign jurisdiction, nothing we can do. That's going to necessarily result in the lower court issuing some sort of subsequent order, if not today, very shortly, that either the Trump administration has to take affirmative steps to do something, or she could potentially hold them in contempt for their conduct and their responses already, which if I had done that in any of my litigations would have likely gotten me there. That would then be appealed and make its way rather quickly back to the Supreme Court, who then has a choice. Their choice will be either to sort of weasel out of their original order and somehow give the Trump administration cover, which I think is probably not going to happen from at least a majority of the court, and instead direct the Trump administration to do something to bring this person back. Because otherwise, we no longer live in a democracy, we live in a dictatorship, because the administration is not free to violate court orders at their whim. The problem would arise, of course, is if they do that and the Trump administration still continues not to respond in any affirmative way to do anything, because courts don't have great enforcement mechanisms. And you really are then in a total breakdown of a democratic rule of law country, which I think is potentially going to happen.
Let's roll it back real quickly. I've seen some smart talking heads suggest that the 9-0 decision initially was maybe sort of unanimous because the language in the decision was purposefully loose, right? It's, saying that they needed to facilitate the return, which isn't really necessarily a legal term, or maybe it is, but it's given, Stephen Miller, he said this in the Oval Office yesterday, it's given him room to say that the Trump administration won, even though the 9-0 ruling was ostensibly against the Trump administration. Do you think that's true? I mean, do you think that there's, I guess, what do you make of Stephen Miller claiming this to be a win? Is that just posture? It seems absurd on the face of it.
It is absurd. Stephen Miller's not making that in any courtroom under any oath. So it's easy to say whatever he wants to say for whatever that's worth. But I think that the key here is the court made a ruling that this person is entitled to some degree of due process, and there was no degree of due process, and therefore the administration has to facilitate something to provide him that due process. There hasn't been an adjudication as to what process is due, just that he was not afforded any which is the constitutional violation. So the question ultimately becomes, was the language sort of mishmashy to give the administration wiggle room? Yes and no. There's no wiggle room with respect to providing due process of some sort.
Even to undocumented immigrants? I mean,
Well, sure, because he's in the country. He has a due process right. He has a liberty interest in some degree of due process here legally or otherwise. And as I understand it, this guy was in the country perhaps illegally, but was the subject of immigration proceedings. And there was an order from 2019 directing him not to be deported back to El Salvador. Now, I know that there's been purportedly, according to the administration, they've changed the standing of MS-13. And so therefore that order is wrong, but there's never been a re-adjudication in the immigration court in the first instance to override that order. So what the Trump administration did was they clearly violated the immigration court order not to send him back to El Salvador. They had a remedy. They could have gone back to the immigration court to vitiate or vacate that order, or they could have held a hearing here prior to sticking him on that plane. So he has to have some due process, whatever his immigration status is.
Well, no, wait, real quickly, then I've heard recently also the claim that, and this is cable news, conservative pro-Trump media, saying that he's a terrorist, right? Because of his alleged association with M13, which is a specious claim as far as I can tell. It was just one phone call. It's not been proven. And in fact, Trump administration, the DOJ, they've all basically admitted that this was a mistake, that he was arrested and deported. But if he were technically, and I'm not saying that he is, part of a terrorist group that is, I guess, M13, this gang, would that preclude him from due process, or do even terrorists get due process?
In the United States, everybody gets due process. That's a different question than saying you're entitled to a full and formal court hearing. The process that can be administrative, it can be a variety of different things, but there has got to be a degree of due process, if only to ascertain that the person you're picking up off the streets with no notice is the person you're supposed to be picking up off the streets. So obviously there has to be some degree of due process to the extent the person is in the United States. The argument they're really making now is not that they picked him up correctly or incorrectly. It's that he's out of our jurisdiction and we have no control over El Salvador. That's a preposterous argument. The constitutional violation is in the first instance, is in not picking him up with any degree of due process and then sending him out of the country. Those acts all occurred in the United States of America by American governmental officials, had nothing to do with El Salvador. All El Salvador's role here, as I understand it, and from all the reporting, is to abide by a contract they have to provide prison services to the United States. Be shocking to me if there wasn't some language in those contracts that allowed the United States some degree of control or access over those prisoners, and that would raise into a whole host of other different questions. But this is an absurd claim by the administration that because he's in El Salvador, there's nothing we can do, and it flips everything. It puts the cart before the horse. The violations are in taking him into custody here and shipping him out of the country without anything whatsoever being afforded to whatever rights he might have had, legal or otherwise, immigration legal or otherwise. He has the right to due process according to a 9-0 Supreme Court, period. The Trump administration is saying he doesn't. That's just wrong. So now the question is, what's the court going to do? And if the court changes, the court's lost all its ability to control this administration. And if the court sticks with its guns and does the right thing legally, then the question is, what's the Trump administration going to do?
Well, so let's stop right there. So you are on the Supreme Court, or you have a window into it. This comes back to the Supreme Court, as you predicted, in the next day or so, quickly. Do you think, how do you think that vote, what happens? Do you think that it's a 7-2 vote that says that he needs to be extradited back to the United States? How do you predict that? Obviously, it's a prediction you don't know, but what do you think is going to happen?
We never know any of our predictions until we don't get paid by the bookie. But it would seem to me that I would be shocked if at least 6 and probably 7 of the justices said that the Trump administration's responses to the lower court were acceptable. I find that it's extra legal. Their responses are extra legal outside of normal legal process and are just clearly insufficient. I'd be shocked if anybody other than Thomas and Alito accepted that. What the ruling is thereafter, I mean, it would conceivably, you could afford, there is some argument, I suppose, that you could afford him due process within El Salvador if you sent down an American hearing officer of some sort to hold a hearing. So to that extent, he might not even have to come back, to the extent you can fashion some sort of appropriate procedure and do it there under American auspices. That's sort of conjecture. But I'd be shocked if the court didn't order the Trump administration to do something to facilitate what they ordered, which is to provide some degree of due process. And as I understand the original order, they directed that he be brought back. So given the Trump posture, what they're really doing is they're looking to set up a constitutional crisis and to crash the power and authority of the Supreme Court such that Trump is really just a total dictator. That seems to me an intentional malevolent act that they're engaged in right now.
Well, I mean, part of me, I can see at least I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I disagree with the Trump posture, but I can at least see the reasoning in it, in that they, I think it's awful, but they're worried about a precedent being set that the Supreme Court will then be able to dictate all of these deportations, right? And so they're basically trying to, right now they're trying to stall. They're saying like, oh, we don't have to because it's a foreign jurisdiction and it was a facilitation, blah, blah, blah. But
that's the point, I think. The point is not what happens once these people are deported. The point is what enables them to be deported. And they have to have due process in that first instance. Trump's argument, as I understand it, is he issued these executive orders. He declared MS-13 a terrorist organization, and that's all the process that these people are entitled to. That's not in any way, shape, or form consistent with American law for hundreds of years. You cannot pick people up off the street who you believe, the government cannot pick people up off the street who they believe are undesirable and just ship them on, Shanghai them. That's literally what they've done. They've Shanghaied this guy.
right.
This guy is not simply an illegal. He has an order in effect. And you can't just say we changed the rules, that order is no longer in effect, which is what Miller argued, I believe, yesterday.
Right.
You can't say, oh, we changed MS-13's designation, so therefore we can kick him out. We can do anything we want because it's foreign policy. It's not foreign policy what happens to people in the United States. It's foreign policy once he's in El Salvador. And so that's a different argument. But the court has absolute ability to direct how people within the United States boundaries and borders are dealt with and what degree of protections and due process they have. Otherwise, Trump could do this to anybody. He could literally do it to you. He could pick you up coming out of your apartment on the way to some hot date and stick you on a plane and get you out of the country. And what's your remedy? What's your recourse if you're in a foreign country, according to their argument?
Going to call you.
Exactly. That's correct. But I'm a family man. But at the end of the day, they haven't, at the time of his being stuck on the plane, they didn't have any actual proper identification of this guy.
Right.
So how can that be the law? How can that be constitutional?
Well, so that kind of pivots to like the political media, the narrative surrounding this, which I think is a big part of it. It's clear to me that Tom Homan and Trump, it's all about show. They want to really, the reason why border crossings are at a record low is they've made it very, very clear to anyone that may want to come into the country, don't, because you'll be sent to I mean, it's the cruelty is the point. The theatrics, the political theater is proving to be a very effective deterrent. Is it ethical? Is it legal? Is it constitutional? No. And that's
what I mean.
Attention.
Well, I would say I would think it's a different constitutional question to prevent people from coming in,
right,
than it to send people out. Those are different.
Yeah, questions. I was talking more broadly about like, the TV narrative. But to that point is we've heard political media talk about constitutional crisis all the time. And I think we're actually at the first time, this is the closest we've actually come to a constitutional crisis. And there's a boy who's cried wolf phenomenon where we're numb to it. And I'm shocked that this isn't getting more outrage and coverage, because it's clear to me that the executive branch is not abiding by checks and balances, right? The rock, paper, scissors nature of our American democracy is failing. So what happens if the Trump administration gets this secondary ruling from the Supreme Court and they simply say no? What then happens politically? I mean, you said it, that's a dictatorship.
That's that's the definition of a dictatorship, when the laws are not abided by the government, and not even the laws, the rulings of the judiciary and the courts are not abided by the government. And again, there's a distinction between what happens with respect to foreign relations. What they did to this gentleman isn't foreign relations. Getting him back arguably has something to do with it, but taking him up off the street and sticking him on a plane, that's not foreign relations. It's completely internal relations, and it's completely in violation of the Constitution. So if the court issues a ruling that he's got to be brought back, or whatever ruling that they might fashion, and the Trump administration says, go jump in a lake, we're not going to abide by that, courts have real problems. Courts don't have an army. Courts don't have a militia. They've got maybe some court officers trying to avoid getting injured, getting their pensions, right. And they have marshals in the U.S. courts. But I don't believe a marshal can go down to El Salvador and get this guy back. I don't believe the courts have any real mechanism of enforcement other than holding the lawyers and the administration officials in contempt. That's their enforcement mechanism. So that would require, you got to
holding Trump in contempt.
You got to give due process even to hold a lawyer in contempt, whatever that might be. So there'd be notice of a hearing. There'd have to be a hearing, and there'd have to be some fact finding, and then that lawyer could be incarcerated. She could conceivably, or any court could conceivably order, the director to come in, or order the Secretary of State, or order even the president to come in and testify, and then find them in contempt. If there's the rule of law, yes, they can absolutely hold the president in contempt. Contempt, by the way, is different than criminal. Civil contempt is not criminal contempt. So the immunity that he got from that other Supreme Court ruling wouldn't necessarily apply to a civil contempt finding, just like he's not immune from civil findings.
This wouldn't be official business? This would not be exempt from?
It might be official business, but it's within the context of a judicial proceeding. To fail to show up, to fail to comply with a court order, to fail to provide discovery, the civil remedy for those things in a litigation, this is just a litigation,
right,
is to hold the party who flouts the court rulings in contempt. The remedy could be money, it could be your answer stricken, it could be, you go to
sending Trump to an El Salvador prison. That could be a remedy.
No, that would be foreign policy. They could stick him up to the Bronx House of Detention, where they have a civil contempt window, if it was in New York. But yeah, that's at the end of the day, court's ability to enforce its judgments is limited to the powers that it can actually enforce, and that would be to hold them in civil contempt. And they could order somebody to come to a hearing, and within the context of that hearing, they could take them into a holding pen. Happens to lawyers all the time, unfortunately. So then they calm down and they apologize, and everybody goes about their business. But the point being is that this is on a different magnitude and a different scale, and you have an administration that clearly is looking for this fight, it seems to me. And they want to.
Yeah, I mean, they control the conflict, control the narrative, control the media, and then websites like Mediaite and every cable news outlet chases it. Like we can't resist, not taking the bait. Wrapping up,
it's more than that. They are looking for a fight to garner and gather more power for the administration.
Right.
And if you flout court orders, and if you don't comply with court orders, the courts are then no longer an equal branch of government.
Well, we saw that with, the court injunction said that they had to allow an AP reporter into the Oval Office. And there was an event with the El Salvador president yesterday, or rather I should say on Tuesday or Monday, and they flouted the injunction. And so basically they're ignoring court orders. It's not just the Supreme Court, it's sort of across the board. And it's like I guess you're right, looking to establish more power. And you're right, that's a dictatorship. The last part, I think, is the political part, which is the only other sort of remedy to this within the checks and balances, is Congress stepping up and either holding hearings or even impeachment, which it's difficult to imagine, given the current congressional makeup, that actually happening, because Congress, led by the Republican Party, has shown thus far that they're not willing to provide any check or balance to the executive branch either. So, I mean,
Well,
is that a fair assessment?
yeah, I think that is a fair assessment. Congress has clearly abrogated its responsibilities in multiple respects, more so with tariffs than with this. But yeah, Congress has been an unadulterated, unmitigated disgrace. And why somebody wants to give away their own power and control is beyond me. But ask Mr. Johnson. So
I think that they're more interested in getting reelected and playing nice with the wannabe dictator than they are perhaps abiding by the Constitution. Andy, thank you so much for doing this, dude. This has been very enlightening, and I appreciate you taking the time.
You got it. Take care.
Please click the like and subscribe buttons for more videos like this. I'm Mediaite founding editor Colby Hall. Thank you for watching.